Hi, everyone. We're just going to let people fill in and enter the webinar, and we'll get started in just a minute. Thanks so much for joining us today. We're very excited to be presenting our webinar on growing and celebrating local grains. And I think it's 2 o'clock exactly here on the East Coast, so we'll get going. Becca, if you want to advance my slides there. I'm just going to give a quick overview for anyone who isn't familiar with Old Ways. I'm Caroline. I'm the Senior Director of Operations here at Old Ways, and I lead the Whole Grains Council program. And Old Ways is a nonprofit organization that is dedicated to improving public health by inspiring individuals and organizations to embrace healthy, sustainable joys of the old ways of eating. We are best known for creating the Mediterranean Diet Pyramid in partnership with the Harvard School of Public Health, and for our third-party certification program, which certifies the whole grain content of products and approves them to use the whole grain stamp on their packages. Next slide. The Whole Grains Council is a program of Old Ways, and it has a three-part mission. So we help consumers to find whole grains and understand their health benefits. We help manufacturers and restaurants create more and better and more delicious whole grain foods. And we help the media to write accurate and compelling stories about whole grains. Next slide. So just a few quick notes, and I'll hand things over to Becca. Today, our webinar is in celebration of International Whole Grain Day, which is something that is put on by the Whole Grain Initiative Group, an international consortium of different stakeholders all around the world. And we are very excited to have Rebekah Schulz here today. She's an RD. She's also a PhD candidate from the University of Minnesota. And she's going to be talking about her research on local grains. Before we get started, I just wanted to let you know that everyone will receive an email within about a week with links to the webinar recording and also slightly revised slides from today's session. Some of the research Becca's covering is not published yet, so we'll just omit those few slides and send you the rest. Please note that today's session is not available for CPEU credit, though you can find many webinar recordings on our website, which are. And we would just ask that you submit your questions through the Q&A function on Zoom rather than the comments or the chat. It just makes it a little easier to keep track of all of the questions. And we will have a Q&A session at the end where we'll get to answer a lot of the questions that come up. So happy International Whole Grain Day, and I will let Becca take it from here.
Awesome. Thanks, Caroline. Are you able to hear me okay? Awesome. Great. Okay, well, as Caroline said, welcome to you all. We're so glad that you're joining us today. As Caroline said, my name is Rebekah Schulz, and I am happy to present today's webinar. I'm a PhD student at the University of Minnesota, studying consumer acceptance of local grains and partnering with the Artisan Grain Collaborative, a regional grain chain supporting the upper Midwest states, as well as Old Ways Whole Grains Council. So I am really excited to share today's webinar with you in celebration of International Whole Grain Day. So let's dive right in. We're going to be learning about growing and celebrating local grains, how consumers connect with whole and local grain products in a landscape of emerging local grain economies. Again, a little shout out for celebrating International Whole Grain Day. I'm glad that we can join together on this webinar, wherever you might be calling in from. All right, so this slide is just going to provide a little overview of what we'll be talking about today. So the first half of the webinar, we're going to be looking at the scoping review research, which looked at whole grain, local grain, and alternative grain network consumer acceptance. So we'll walk through the methods, key factors, and recommendations for both whole grains, local grains, and alternative grain networks. And then in the second half, we're going to be looking at the 2025 Whole Grains Council Survey local grain findings. So we'll be going over the key findings, the profiling of local grain consumer segments, which will be really fun. And if methods of scoping reviews are really boring to you, stick around because we're going to be sharing some really fun slides from the 2025 survey, which provide a lot of insights about how folks are thinking about local grain. So you don't want to miss it. We'll finish today's webinar with a summary and some recommendations, and then we'll have time for questions and responses at the end. So excited to dig into this with you. And finally, just a note before we get started, I'm going to be using the terms alternative grain network and local grain economy synonymously. So I'll define that in a little bit here, but just a note to all of us as we continue. All right, so the goal of all of this for today's webinar is that we really want to establish an enhanced understanding of how U.S. consumers interact with whole and local grain products. So this is going to provide us a little webinar roadmap. Like I said, we're going to start with looking at the whole grain consumer acceptance findings from the scoping review. We'll then move to looking at alternative grain network and local grain consumer acceptance findings from the scoping review. We'll finish with exciting results from the 2025 Whole Grain Survey on consumer acceptance of local grains portion. Again, all with that goal of helping to establish an enhanced understanding of how U.S. consumers interact with whole and local grain products. All right, so we're going to start here looking at consumer acceptance of whole grains as found in this scoping review. All right, so you may be asking yourself, what is a scoping review? Great question. A scoping review is an established way to look at the existing literature on a topic and then consolidate it into the review and map out the main concepts, the types of evidence, and the gaps in the literature to inform future studies, policy, and practice. It often follows an established protocol so as to produce a rigorous result. So this is the scoping review process. You start with defining the research question, which I'll share here momentarily for our scoping review. You then define your exclusion and inclusion criteria of what you will and will not include in terms of literature. You then define your search strategy, the terms you will use, and the databases you'll use. You'll then conduct the search followed by screening out the studies you won't use, extracting the data from those that remain, and synthesizing that data into trends and gaps in the research. So for our scoping review, we were interested in looking at the current literature for U.S. consumer acceptance of whole grains, local grains, and local grain economies or alternative grain networks. And you can see that reflected in our three research questions here. So our first research question looked at what are the key factors influencing U.S. consumers' acceptance of grains, including reasons that motivate or deter them. So things like nutrition, price, dietary practices, and taste. And then our second question is what are the key factors influencing U.S. consumers' acceptance of local or regional grain products? And our final question was on how U.S. consumers engage with grains, including through the commodity grain system or alternative grain networks. So the inclusion criteria for the articles we would include, those articles need to address key elements of the research questions. They needed to be published in 2013 or later. English language articles, and these were the article types. So we looked at dissertations, theses, and peer-reviewed journal articles. The exclusion criteria, basically everything opposite to the inclusion criteria. So We didn't include articles that looked at producer interactions primarily, non-food grains, grain-based or grain additive products from more of a sensory perspective or like a food science, food formulation perspective. Studies that were looking just at health outcomes or health interventions, and then market analyses of grains or food waste of grains. All right, so the methods, we all love methods. We defined 5 databases in which we were going to search for our articles. We defined our search strategy. We conducted the search, and then we entered all of our findings. So all of the articles that we gathered into a software called Covidence. And then we conducted our screening. So we got 14,155 articles, which is not a small number, let me tell you. And through 2 rounds of screening, we got down to 31 articles. So shout out to my amazing co-screener, Hallie Lundquist. And from these 31 articles, we then just conducted a hand search and we retrieved one additional article, bringing us to a grand total of 32 articles. So this is the literature that we read in depth and mapped out, okay, what are we seeing when it comes to consumer acceptance of these products and these systems? Of those 32 articles, 29 of them looked at whole grains and other grain networks, or I'm sorry, other grain products, and then 3 looked at alternative grain networks and local grains. So we're going to get into those findings now, but you can see that there's a lot on whole grains and there's just not a lot right now in the research when it comes to consumer acceptance of alternative grain networks and local grains. So we're going to dive into those details. All right, big picture findings per our criteria. All studies that we included, so all 32 of those were conducted in the US between the years 2013 and 2024. And there was a variety of study methodologies, with surveys as the most common research method, followed by mixed methods, which is usually survey and focus groups combination, or it could be other components, and then epidemiological studies. But you can see that there's quite a variety of study methodologies that were employed in these 32 articles. All right, these were the types of grain categories that were in these articles. So whole grains is the biggest category at the top there. 21 of the articles mentioned whole grains and consumer acceptance of them. And then you can see at the bottom there, the other grain categories. These were just categories that didn't really fit anywhere else. And so you can see a number of grain products listed there. You can see in the middle there that organic grain products and local or regional grain products had 3 articles each that spoke about these. All right, so these are the 4 categories that the consumer acceptance factors fell into. And the literature groups these categories differently, but basically each of these categories is just something that impacts consumer acceptance of a food product. And in our case, a grain product. So psychographic factors, for example, attitude, knowledge, beliefs is going to impact someone's consumer acceptance of a food. Sociodemographic factors, so education, age, gender, etc., are going to impact consumer acceptance. Built environment and community programming factors, such as shopping location or program participation. And then finally, the product-related attributes themselves. So the taste of the product, the ingredients, the brand, all of that is going to impact whether or not a consumer accepts that product. And so we decided to break these out from the literature into these 4 categories so as to be able to say, okay, what are we seeing and what recommendations can we make from there? All right, this is a little bit of a busy slide, but we'll just walk through it. So basically then you'll see those gold bars here represent the categories that I just spoke about. And you'll see that I added a 5th category here, so intervention. So basically, this category just represents when the literature was using an intervention and a factor to increase consumer acceptance. And then underneath each of those categories, you'll see the factors that affect consumer acceptance. And then across the top, we have the different types of grain product categories. So, for example, in this whole grain box, you can see that there are 7 articles in the literature that look at taste as a factor affecting consumer acceptance of whole grain. And looking across, you can kind of map those things out. And this just kind of shows us the frequency with which literature is talking about this, as well as the gaps. So, for example, here, organic grain products and local grain products are not really being talked about in terms of familiarity or convenience. So these just represent potential areas for future research, as well as tell us what is heavily researched and what might we glean from that. All right, so due to time limits, these are the factors that we're going to focus on, as well as just due to the fact that they were the ones that were the most frequently reported in the literature. And those key factors affecting whole grain consumer acceptance are taste, price, familiarity, education, and knowledge. All right, so we're going to dive into what the literature said about each of these factors. So, taste was a key factor that affected consumer acceptance of whole grains, which I think you and I can all agree with. We want our food to taste good. So, nothing necessarily new there, but it's just what's being talked about. So, not only is taste a key factor for whole grain, but also organic specialty bakery products and other categories, such as brewer spent grains, sorghum, whole grain pasta, cereal and a special high oxidant sweet corn. So taste is a key factor for all of these groups. It's a positive driver for children and adults alike, and it's a deterrent when it's not tasty, which again, pretty intuitive. There was strong consensus that taste tests and taste assurances really lead to increased consumer acceptance, which I think is challenging in this day and age when we receive a lot of communication visually, so whether through words or social media, but how do we really get taste experiences in front of our consumers to really help increase engagement with the products? Moving on to a next factor. So price was a key factor impacting consumer acceptance. Again, nothing new there. But we saw in these groups, caregivers, low-income adults, and university students, whole grains were perceived to be more expensive than their refined grain counterparts. Now, this may not always be true, so there may be some education opportunities here, which is exciting. The studies show that there was really high segmentation in consumer willingness to pay for these different items. So basically saying you have a market spread on what people are willing to pay and willing not to pay, and maybe we can index people in different directions. And then for certain products, taste tests and taste assurances increased people's willingness to pay. So basically, the more that someone had the ability to taste something, or the package said, has a nutty flavor or tastes excellent, like even something like that really helped increase someone's willingness to pay for an item. But funnily enough, education on the benefits or the nutrition of that product did not change the willingness to pay. So just something to note there. In regards to familiarity as a factor influencing consumer acceptance of whole grains, we saw that lack of familiarity was a barrier for whole grain consumption in low-income adults, as well as for the average consumer when it came to purchasing organic wheat products, such as bread and cookies. However, exposure to whole grains over a 6-week period resulted in significant improved ratings of liking, sensory profile, and willingness to include those whole grains in their diet. And then again, when folks had familiarization with the product taste and education about the benefits of whole grains for these various products, it really aided in consumer acceptance. Finally, the last factor that we're going to discuss in regards to education and knowledge as a factor affecting consumer acceptance of whole grains, we saw that general knowledge about whole grain identification and whole grain preparation is low. Knowledge barriers include correctly identifying whole grains based on the ingredients list, being able to differentiate between a whole grain product and a refined grain product, and the definition of whole grain foods. Additional barriers include lack of skills and recipes for meal prep, as well as just lack of strategies and ways to know how to encourage children to engage with whole grains. However, 3 studies showed that providing education resulted in increased whole grain consumption with a variety of strategies. But two studies showed that nutrition information and information on organic didn't change willingness to pay. So again, education may really help with increasing consumption, but it may not be the most effective strategy to increase someone's willingness to pay. In fact, in that case, taste may be more effective. So perhaps a layered approach can really help index people towards whole grains in these various ways. All right, so these key factors feed into our whole grain campaign recommendations here. Basically, campaigns that will help increase whole grain consumption. So first, we recommend that public-private partnerships be leveraged to include the following factors for the greatest effective change. And first, what do I mean by public-private partnerships? We mean partnerships between university, industry, health organizations, retailers, and government. And these types of relationships have been found to be the most successful for increasing consumption of whole grains. Particularly this orange symbol here is the Danish whole grain program, and they have been incredibly successful at increasing whole grain consumption in the Danish population. Our U.S. Whole Grains Council and this new Swedish Fullkorns program all have similar relationships and are really working to increase whole grain consumption in their respective countries. So if you can have a public-private partnership that really harnesses and leverages these factors we've been talking about, so taste opportunities for consumers, innovative costing strategies, or ways to communicate about cost of individuals, familiarization and exposure to whole grains to folks, education and knowledge about what whole grains are, how to define them, and then also labeling. So helping folks understand the definition of a whole grain food or what counts and how to use labeling all can be really impactful as a way to help index our populations towards these really delicious and nutritious grains. All right, so now we're going to be moving on to the results for consumer acceptance on alternative grain networks and local grain products from the scoping review. So you might be asking, what is an alternative grain network? Well, there are several synonyms for an alternative grain network, which you've likely already heard me refer to throughout, but these are examples. So synonyms include regional grain chain, alternative grain economy, local grain economy, grain shed, and broadly, alternative grain networks are really a subset of this bigger idea of alternative food networks, which are basically alternates to the industrial food system in a way to produce food in a way that complements other approaches. With that being said, then, alternative grain networks are alternatives to the industrial commodity grain paradigm. Most of the grain that you and I eat typically comes from the commodity system, so it's typically from far away, either in the US or abroad, and it operates with a more consolidated and centralized framework. However, before the 1900s, there used to be over 24,000 small mills scattered across the US, coupled with small bakeries and home bakers. And that number of mills is now around 200, with most mills owned by four large corporations. Alternative grain networks, on the other hand, exist to put grain farms, mills, bakeries, and other retailers back on the landscape, re-regionalizing grains, providing a new value-added crop for farmers, regenerating soil, and creating a value-added, delicious product for consumers that was grown, milled, and made near them. So this is a visual image of what a regional grain chain or local grain economy looks like. So the Artisan Grain Collaborative, which is the lovely regional grain chain that I get to work with, is a regional grain chain serving the 8 upper Midwest states. They are a network of farmers, millers, maltsters, bakers, chefs, food manufacturers, brewers, distillers, researchers, and advocates working together to promote a regenerative food system, which you can see goes all the way from the seeds to enjoying that grain product. Alternative grain networks have been growing in prominence in the US in the past 20 years, as well as in Europe. And this map shows a current list of the various regional grain economies across the US. All right, so in the scoping review, there were only 3 articles in the literature between 2013 and 2024 that looked at consumer acceptance of alternative grain networks and local grains. So these were the key findings that we're going to dig into now that we gleaned from those 3 articles, all of which were case studies. So those key factors for local grain product consumer acceptance included that we saw that consumers prefer local bread, for example, due to their desire to support small businesses and be connected to their local community. So there's really a sense of loyalty here. Community-supported bakeries, which is a model or a type of CSA program, embeds consumers as co-creators of their local grain network and really helps them be engaged with the local grain products that they are consuming. We need more quantitative data on consumer willingness to pay and market potential for these local grain products to really help increase their resiliency and coordination along the grain chain. And finally, consumers preferred the taste, the nutrition, the artisanship, authenticity, and whole grain content of these local grain products. All right, so moving to the alternative grain networks, these were the key factors affecting consumer acceptance of these alternative grain networks. And what we see is that consumer interest in these localized grain networks has really increased since the early 2000s, with increased consumer demand for a variety of products. It's really key that there's coordination along the value chain between producers, millers, distillers, brewers, and bakers in order to deliver these high quality local grain products to consumers. Because these are not centralized networks, you really need to have that grassroots coordination and robust, resilient relationship development in order to make these systems work. Sustained consumer engagement with these alternative grain networks is also key. Again, consumers really need to be part of these and embedded in these to help make them work. And then we saw in one case study that policies may be really helpful for helping folks engage with these alternative grain networks. So the Grow NYC policy in New York State and at the New York green markets mandated that grain products sold there must be made with at least 15% local flour, which is really effective at getting folks to think about, the grains in their bread or the product they were purchasing, and really help folks engage with these alternative grain networks. If you want to look up a more detailed list of the U.S. alternative grain networks, I would invite you to see Nonnemeyer's case study labeled here. This was published in 2024 and examines Colorado and Italy, just a case comparison, but it has some tables at the back that are really helpful to kind of explore these grain networks in the U.S. and Italy, if you happen to want to explore there as well. All right, so wrapping up this section, here are recommendations for helping to increase consumer acceptance of alternative grain networks and local grain products. So we'd recommend collecting more quantitative data, measuring consumer acceptance of these alternative grain networks and local grains for their promotion and increased resiliency. We'd recommend continuing to spread awareness about alternative grain networks and the products that they offer. And finally, thinking about and implementing innovative policy strategies such as those exemplified with Grow NYC as a way to take the burden off of consumers as being the ones to primarily shift towards these grains and really helping it to be system change where we can all be involved. All right, we are on the final segment of our webinar roadmap. So now we're going to look at those fun slides from our local grain question summary from the 2025 Whole Grains Council report. So first, some background. This was conducted between the Artisan Grain Collaborative, the University of Minnesota, and the Old Ways Whole Grains Council as a subset of the larger Whole Grains Council report to look at key insights about how consumers think about local grains. We were so excited to get to be part of this. The Whole Grain Council's survey was conducted in late May through early June, and we had 1,500 census representative respondents between the ages of 18 and 92. And as a subset of the 76 total questions in the larger report, AGC was able to ask 8 questions looking at consumer acceptance of local grains, specifically understanding their perceptions, their attitudes, barriers, and motivators about local grain products. For the larger report, you can go and visit the Whole Grains Council website that's already released, and it has so much great material in it. And then this smaller report, the local grains portion, will be released in early December. So very exciting, and keep your eye out for that. All right, so we are going to dive into the results here. This first graph looks at where consumers are shopping for grains in general. So not just whole grains, not local grains, but just in general, where do you shop for grains? And we see that the majority of consumers shop for grains at supermarkets, making that the most frequent purchasing location of grains for consumers. However, when it comes to local grains, we see that consumers find these most often at farmers markets and co-ops, which, if most people are looking or interfacing with grains at supermarkets, they're not going to be interacting with local grains there. So potentially some cool, innovative strategies there. All right, we can see that consumers are interested in local grain versions of all products. So they're not preferring one type of product to be local over the other. And you can see here on the right-hand bar, we go from breads, rolls, buns, and pizza, breakfast cereals, flour, all the way down to pancakes and waffles and cookies, cakes, and baked treats. These only differ by a 5% gap in terms of what folks are saying they would choose for a local grain version of. So we can really see that if you are a local grain maker, that you can really go into any of these areas and folks would be willing to purchase, potentially purchase one of these items. We can see that there's about 40% of people who say they care about local grains. So in the amount in green there, but we also have about 40% who are neutral and 17% who are not interested. So we can see that there is still some great work to be done to help consumers see and understand the value in local grains. We can see here that the largest barrier to purchasing local grains is cost. And underneath that, there are some additional barriers. So availability being one of them, as well as identification. So some cool barriers that we can focus on and work on to be able to get more local grains into consumers' hands. This question showed that consumers differ in how they rank local grains compared to commodity grains. So at the top there, we see that 3 out of 5 consumers believe local grains offer a better benefit to communities than non-local grains. So just stepping back for a moment, this question was basically asking folks to rank how local grains compare to commodity grains or non-local grains on each of these attributes. So benefits to communities, freshness, benefits to the environment, etc. And to say, were they the same? Were they better? So in the green, were they the same, the gray, or were they worse in the orange? So they had to go through each of these attributes. And we can see that for benefits to communities, freshness, benefits to the environment, nutrition and health benefits, consumers were saying that local grains are better than non-local grains. But there's still a significant portion that are saying that they are about the same or worse for a lot of these attributes. So education opportunities definitely abound for those attributes to help consumers really understand the amazing array of benefits that come with eating and supporting local grain. This slide outlines the motivators consumers noted would motivate them to buy more local grains. And we can see that taste opportunities, packaging, and information on true cost are the top motivators. True cost was a little vaguely defined. We could have done a better job with that. But basically, what we're understanding it to mean is the whole story of what went into that product. So impacts on the environment, impacts on community, etc. Essentially, the story of that product. So this is a cool slide, a way to see what are ways we can help motivate more people towards these local grain products. All right, this slide outlines a question we asked to understand what people were willing to pay for a local grain product compared to a standard or commodity grain product. We asked consumer willingness to pay for a pancake mix when it was local, and then when it was whole grain and local compared to a standard pancake mix at $2.99. So you can see here that standard larger company pancake mix at $2.99. And we said, what are you willing to pay if it's local? And they could pay up to $10. And we saw that on average, folks were willing to pay a premium of $1.60 more for that local grain mix. And then we said, okay, what if it's local and whole grain? And we saw that folks were willing to pay $1.98 premium for that mix. So we can see that on average, folks are willing to pay more for these attributes. This slide just breaks that all down a little bit more, just to see each consumer segment and their willingness to pay a premium for these products, based on a premium going up to $10. So at the top there, we can see that, the majority of folks are willing to pay a premium for a local grain pancake mix or whole grain. But the question is, what amount of premium? So um, we can see on the left hand here, this is asking again how much they're willing to pay for when it's local. And we can see that 19% of people are not willing to pay anything more. So if they have a $2.99 conventional mix and they have a local mix, they're not willing to pay more than what that standard mix already is. However, 33% of folks are willing to pay 25 cents or $1 more. And then it keeps going from there. Um, and the same with the local grain, whole grain mix. 13% are not willing to pay anything more than the $2.99, and 31% are willing to pay 25 cents to $1 more, et cetera, and it goes on. So we can just see that willingness to pay is pretty stratified across consumers, and may be just helpful to know when we're costing out products. All right, so now we're going to move into insights from the consumer segmentation of these local grain findings. So this was really fun. We performed a statistical analysis. Well, I wouldn't say the statistical analysis part was fun. That's intense, but the outcome was fun. We found that there were three different types of consumers of local grain. Local grain enthusiasts, you'll see there in the green, local grain idealists, and local grain value skeptics. So these folks were determined by how they clustered around two attributes. You can see there in the bold. So how they valued the practical aspects of grain, so or local grain, so their nutrition and their freshness, and then the social and personal aspects of grain, so how they benefited the environment and connection to the local community. So we're just going to go through these each briefly. You can see that for local grain enthusiasts, they really value grains for their practical and social and environmental benefits. Local grain idealists value local grains for their social and environmental benefits, but they're unconvinced of their practical benefits. And then local grain value skeptics are skeptical of local grains' social and environmental benefits, and they are neutral on their practical benefits. And now we're just going to go into slides highlighting each of those types of consumers and the demographics for each. So again, just a reminder, individuals who are local grain enthusiasts are those who really value grains for their social and environmental benefits as well as their practical attributes. And they have the following socio-demographic characteristics. So they're more likely to be parents. They're more likely to be from the younger generation, so Gen Zers and millennials. They're more likely to identify as Black/African American or Hispanic/Latinx, and they are more likely to be urban dwellers. Idealists, on the other hand, so those that are pumped about local grain social and environmental benefits, but are unconvinced about their practical attributes, are less likely to be parents than the enthusiasts, but more likely to be parents than the value skeptics. They're more likely to be from the younger generation, so Gen Z and millennials. So enthusiasts and idealists share that in common. They're more likely to identify as white, and they're more likely to be suburban dwellers. All right, and finally, local grain value skeptics, so those who are skeptical about the social and environmental benefits of local grains and neutral on their practical attributes, are less likely to be parents than both groups. Excuse me, they're more likely to be from the older generations, so Gen X, boomers, and the silent generation, more likely to identify as white and more likely to be suburban dwellers. So we can see that each segment is a little different from one another on the demographics. All right, so now we're going to go through some graphs that highlight some of these differences on overall shopping, general food preferences, lifestyle, and local and whole grain preferences by these three consumer segments. So this slide shows that when it comes to general food preferences, Enthusiasts and idealists are more likely to say that buying healthy food is a priority for them. They look for products with lots of fiber. They eat home cooked meals, and they are more likely to bake at home. All of these more than value skeptics. Both idealists and enthusiasts also tend to prioritize health more than value skeptics. So they are more likely to say that buying healthy food is a priority for them. They exercise at least 4 times a week, and that they care that their grain products are made with whole grains. And they are the inner two colors there. Again, more than value skeptics. This slide tells us that enthusiasts are the most enthusiastic about grain products, and they have fewer barriers from purchasing these. So, taste and price are both not as much of a barrier when it comes to deciding about purchasing decisions. So, the price of the product is less likely to influence them, and the taste and flavor is less likely. This is contrary to idealists and value skeptics who are more likely to say that price and taste of a product are really a major factor. So, really important to pay attention to based on who your consumers are. Enthusiasts and idealists are more likely to go where local grains are. So they're more likely to shop at co-ops or natural food stores and farmers markets than value skeptics. As a result, value skeptics may be less likely to engage with local grain products just due to a lower frequency of attendance at these locations where they more commonly are. And then we just see that enthusiasts and idealists are also more likely to just buy grains generally at grocery stores, supermarkets, or super centers. So again, they not only probably buy more grains, but they also are at locations where local grains are more available. All right, this chart is a little busy, but it's basically telling us that both enthusiasts and idealists really prize environmental choices and environmental benefits of local grains. And they're more likely to choose foods because of the environmental benefits, use eco-friendly modes of transit, use eco-friendly or sustainable products, and really care whether the grain products are regeneratively grown. As well as organically grown, as well as locally grown. So they really value the environmental aspect of life, but also of grain products specifically. They also value local grains and in our agreement about the social benefits they provide. So both of them think that local grains offer benefits to communities and support better connections to growers or makers compared to value skeptics who are more skeptical of this. However, enthusiasts and idealists go different ways here. So they differ in their beliefs about whether local grains have practical or functional value. So enthusiasts are more likely to believe that local grains improve product taste, that they offer better nutrition and health benefits, that they're priced more favorably, and that they result in a fresher product than commodity grains. And value skeptics are really low on their views on the practical or functional value of these. Enthusiasts and idealists are more interested in a variety of grain product offerings. So beyond the kind of idea of something just being local or being whole grain, they are also more likely to seek out ancient grain products. So things like emmer, farro, einkorn, and spelt, gluten-free products, buckwheat, millet, and sorghum, heritage or landrace wheat products, and then sprouted grain products. So in general, they're just more apt and likely to try a variety of grains. Enthusiasts are the group that are the most passionate about whole grains specifically, and they're the most savvy at identifying them. So they're more likely to say they choose whole grains at least half the time. They say they should eat a lot more whole grains than they already do. They look for the whole grain stamp when they are choosing products to buy, and they say it's very easy to determine if a food contains whole grains. And this is comparison to value skeptics who are less likely to prioritize whole grains and are more likely to say they have trouble identifying these foods. And idealists fall somewhere in the middle there. All right, we are on our last slide here for the findings. And this chart again shows how price is not as big of a barrier for enthusiasts. They are the most likely or the most willing on average to pay a higher premium for both local grain pancake mix and a local whole grain pancake mix. So you can see there that they're willing to pay a premium of 280 for that local whole grain pancake mix and a premium of 233 on average for the local grain pancake mix. Idealists are the next group willing to pay the next average highest amount, followed by value skeptics. All right, so we're going to finish today with a summary, bringing together the components of today's webinar. So, with our established goal of basically establishing an enhanced understanding of how consumers interact with whole and local grain products, what are our key takeaways and recommendations when we bring together the findings from the scoping review and the consumer survey all together? So, for whole grains, is that we'd recommend public-private partnerships that can leverage these attributes of whole grains to increase consumer acceptance. So, whole grain taste opportunities, cost strategies, familiarization, education, and labeling to increase whole grain consumer acceptance. And then for local grains and alternative grain networks, we'd recommend generating quantitative data on consumer acceptance on these US alternative grain networks and local grain products, just to better map out their market potential, their size, and how to better coordinate and increase resiliency. Increase overall awareness about local grains, leverage taste opportunities, packaging and labeling, and information on a product story to increase local grain consumer acceptance. And then index these folks who may be a little less enthusiastic, so local grain idealists and value skeptics towards local grains through maybe education on social, environmental, and practical benefits. And then get local grains into consumers' hands. So find innovative ways to get consumers where local grains are, or to get local grains where consumers are. All right, we're going to be wrapping up here. So a big thank you to you all for your time here, as well as to my partners listed here. So to Old Ways Whole Grains Council, big thank you to Caroline and the team. Thank you to John, Elena, and Alyssa at the Artisan Grain Collaborative and my advisory committee there, which really helped inform the questions and survey strategy from a community participatory approach. The SARE student grant, and then my advisors at the University of Minnesota, Dr. Hikaru Peterson and Dr. Len Marquardt. Here's some really fun reference slides. And then we are going to open it up for questions, and I'm going to pass it back to Caroline to moderate this portion.
Thank you so much, Becca. That was a really great overview of the local grain landscape, shall we say. Um, we have a couple questions about definitions that came in. Someone asked how we define whole grain, and I can certainly take that one.
Of course.
So whole grains are grains that still maintain all of their original bran, germ, and endosperm in their original proportions. And whole grains are often eaten in their intact kernel form, but they can also be cracked, puffed, popped, ground into flour, and as long as they still maintain all three original parts of the kernel, they are still considered whole grain. And then the other definition, someone wondered how you are defining consumer acceptance in I think specifically in the scoping review.
Definitely. Yeah, let me pull up, trying to find that slide here. So consumer acceptance is really defined as in the studies, it was anything that mentioned a variety of factors. So when attitude was mentioned, willingness to pay, perception, belief, preference, all of these, the kind of the field of consumer acceptance and marketing uses those as terms to say, okay, those are all influencing consumer acceptance. So basically, if an article mentioned those things or mentioned consumer acceptance, it was included. It's a great question.
Thank you.
Mhm.
I'm gonna just see. Oh, let's see. We've got a question here. What is the best way for my farm to market? For my farm to market our baked goods that contain heirloom grains grown and milled on the farm and then prepared into the baked goods. Should they use additional signage, stickers on products? What do you think, based on your research, would be the most effective?
Yeah. Yeah, thanks for that question, Kristen. I want to start by I'm in no ways a marketing expert, but I'll try to answer just from what we've seen and then also what various folks at the Artisan Grain Collaborative seem to be trying. But I think from the literature, from what we're seeing, is that taste opportunities are really helpful, along with the story, along with the labeling. So, kind of that three-layered approach. I don't know if you are operating directly with consumers or if it's more of like an online marketplace, but if there's a way that you can provide a story about heirloom grains, the name of them, where they came from, their history, and then also maybe flavor notes about what that heirloom grain is like. And calling it out in the package along with that taste opportunity, I think is just a really great kind of fully wrapped way for someone to experience that. So I guess to be concise, I think, yeah, labeling it, providing taste opportunities, and then really providing the story of that item is a great way to help folks even just begin to become familiar, get it in front of their face. And then the more that they try it and experience it, I think the more they'll really fall in love with what you're making. It certainly sounds delicious. I would love to try some.
Yeah, and I'll just add that I thought it was so interesting, Becca, when you said that in the scoping review you found that descriptions on the package like delicious nutty flavor
Mhm.
led to a higher willingness to pay, even in the absence of education around health benefits or environmental benefits. And so that may be a tidbit to take away in terms of how to kind of best describe your products.
Yeah, that's a great thought, Caroline. And especially too in like the absence of being able to offer a physical taste, just having that flavor note and even just saying excellent taste was really effective, which is cool. It's kind of a easy and a strategy.
We have a question here about whether you considered consumer preference as it relates to the freshness of the flower, and that is something that we looked at with the survey. But I wondered if you had any other comments on freshness specifically.
Yeah. I'm trying to remember. There were just such few articles on consumer acceptance of um, kind of like locally grown product or locally grown grains and milled grains, et cetera. Certainly, the larger body of literature didn't look at freshness of flour, and I'm trying to remember if those three articles mentioned it at all. I don't think that they did. Certainly, I think anecdotally with, that map that I showed of all of the artisan or all of the alternative grain networks, I think that's a really big thing that is often talked about. And just the fact that flour is like a living, beautiful ingredient to include, especially when it's whole grain and it's milled freshly. And so I don't think the literature spoke about it as much. The survey, like you mentioned, Caroline, we asked folks about that and whether they saw freshness being inherent to local grains, and folks were unsure. So there's definitely educational opportunities there. Um, and then definitely anecdotally, I think that's a lot of the reason why folks engage with alternative grain networks.
Great. Are you aware of any studies of nutrient density or root microbiome of heirloom versus modern wheats that's been done in the US?
Hmm. Yeah, another great question. This is definitely an area that folks are wanting to kind of build up. So the Bread Lab out in, let's see if I can find that, out in Washington State, is doing amazing work in this area and really trying to focus on how do we breed grains in a way that maximizes their nutrient density. And for so long, grains have been, well, not for so long, in the past 100 years, they've been bred for yield and protein, aka gluten. And so, really trying to think more comprehensively about fiber and about these like micronutrients and bioactives that are inherent to grains and breeding in a way that's for whole grain end use because 95% of grains grown in the US end up as white flour. And so, if we can breed grains in a way that delivers a really delicious whole grain product, that's going to help consumers engage with it. And then, as you mentioned, if it's also nutrient dense, it's a huge benefit. So, in terms of the studies that are out there comparing these, I think the results are quite variable. There's a lot of folks that say heirloom grains are inherently always more nutrient dense than modern grains, but it really does depend, or modern wheat, I guess, if you're specifically looking at that. Einkorn and emmer, certainly some of them are higher in protein, but a little bit lower in gluten content. But then some modern wheats, like what the Bread Lab is doing, actually are higher in these in fiber. They're higher in some micronutrients because they're really trying to bring those back into the conversation. So I think there's a lot of variation. And I haven't looked at the root microbiome concept and how that translates. I think that would be super fascinating. So definitely some cool things to dig into there. And thanks for the shout out, Elena.
So we have a question. We heard the word regenerative used in relation to whole grain products in the talk. How would you define that in the US, and how do you feel that people relate to that term?
Mhm. Ooh, that is a tricky one. Regenerative is, I think, at the root of it, it's the idea that we're not just depleting or taking, but that we are regenerating. But it can really mean different things to different people. It's not a standardized term. I think that the Artisan Grain Collaborative, if I can speak for them, would be using it in a way that is trying to maximize soil health practices. So whether that's just mindful tilling practices, keeping living cover on the landscape year round, so there's not soil running off or soil being blown off in the winter, having a cover crop on the soil so you're getting nutrients back in, potentially also using livestock as a way to forage and send nutrients back into the roots, back into the soil. Um, I don't think that they have these are the four things you must do to qualify as regenerative. I think that they're just helping farmers coordinate and network together to index folks more and more towards those practices. There certainly are groups in the US that are trying to standardize that regenerative terminology. So Rodale Institute out on on the East Coast has a regenerative label. There's a group called Real Organic that's trying to get um, some kind of higher standards into the organic label than what the USD label holds. So it kind of gets into this conversation of how helpful or unhelpful these terms are, but certainly I know that the Artisan Grain Collaborative embodies this desire to do as much as possible to get um, soil practices onto farms and to really support farmers in this because they want to do it. So maybe kind of a vague answer for you, but it's a little bit of, unfortunately, a vague a term as well. But great question.
And on that note, I'm going to just drop a link to our main survey report in the comments here. We did ask a few questions about regeneratively grown grains this year in our survey. So you might be interested to see kind of where people fall. About 25% of people said that it was an attribute that they valued in, considering one whole grain product over another. Um, I also just wanted to mention again, I know Becca said this at the beginning, but our local grains report is being finalized right now, and we'll be releasing it at the beginning of December. So you can stay tuned for that. And in the meantime, enjoy the kind of main report. Let's see, we have. So it sounds like there's some research underway in the UK around regenerative agriculture. So be interested to see that.
Yeah, and I think he also mentioned I replied to it, so I think it disappeared. But sounds like there are some studies looking at those mycorrhizal associations. So yeah, I'd be really
Great.
interested to look into that. Thanks for sharing that. Some cool stuff to dive into.
Well, we're just about at the end of our time, and I don't think there are any other questions, so I think we can wrap it up. Thank you so much, Becca. This was really, really interesting, and thank you to everyone who attended.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. It's been a fun afternoon.